What is really going on, crypto savages? You are listening to the CoinSpice podcast with host C. Edward Kelso, editor-in-chief at CoinSpice.io, your home for spicy crypto things on the net.
What is really going on, crypto savages? This is your host, C. Edward Kelso, editor-in-chief out at CoinSpice.io, back with another episode of the CoinSpice podcast. This time around, I've got Tim Swanson. Tim is an incredible voice within the cryptocurrency ecosystem, mostly because he kind of stands outside of it. He has an intimate knowledge of mining, of distributed ledger technology. He also works quite a bit on the enterprise side as an advisor to consortiums. He knows both ends, finance and blockchain cryptocurrency parts. That's super important right now because we're in such an interesting time in our history. We both want to be sort of these cypherpunks, these permissionless, go-go anarchists, screw the bank sort of things, but yet we also want to support Coinbase. We're waiting for Bakkt to come in and save us, and we're waiting for institutional money and ETFs and all the rest of it. So he's a really good person to talk to about that tension. And also, who's controlling the narrative? Who's kind of saying what the history was and how Bitcoin and crypto sort of unfolded and became what it is today. He's a critic on all those fronts and someone who's invaluable to speak to and kind of get a sense of from a literate perspective of where the space is and perhaps where it's headed. I really thought this was a great discussion, and I learned a ton. I think you will too. Without any further ado, here is Tim Swanson.
Yeah, so thanks again for coming on. I really appreciate it. Congratulations, first off, before we get into the formal part of the show. This episode is congratulations on the initial human offering, as Muggles would call it, your baby. Have you gotten any sleep?
The first week and a half was horrible. I don't recommend anyone having kids if the first week and a half for the same thing. We've had our baby girl's just over a month old now, and fortunately my wife has been able to get 6+ hours of sleep. Not as in a long extended period. Just during the evening she's able to get that total amount. So that's great. Myself. I'm getting about that, but there's that phrase, you can never be as happy as your wife is. And so you can never be more happy than your wife, I'm sorry. So yeah, I have to make sure that she's taken care of.
Very cool. Well, again, congratulations. And I appreciate you coming on with such short notice here. Well, let's kind of get into it for folks who might not know you as well as I do and have been following you for as long as I have. To me, you're more recently seeming like almost like a media critic, and I find that side of your work valuable. But you certainly have done a lot more than just that. So can you kind of go into your background a little bit, how it dovetails into crypto?
Yeah, sure. Got into this quote-unquote space. I actually use finger quotes, as I said that completely by accident, not by design. Really late 2012, early 2013, I did some hobbyist mining. I even posted a couple guides on how to set up a GPU system. So I had free electricity in my apartment in Shanghai before moving back to the US. It's funny, I got into all that, and now there's these really angry folks who even deny my own existence in that. So let's pretend that I didn't do anything until early 2014. I published a very short book, which was basically a bit of market research from some investors I spoke to, entrepreneurs, and developers. And I published that, I think it was in March 2014. So it's about 5 years, almost to the day.
Wow.
Yeah, and it's funny, almost all those, if you look through, page through that really fast, basically everything in there is either wrong or massively outdated, or I think people have been either arrested or have been sued. So it's like that I don't recommend anyone go out and buy it. But number two, the space has moved I hate calling it a space because there is it's so ill-defined what that means. But that document propelled me to some other research roles. I think a number of people know me most because of I was early advisor, and then one of the first employees to a company called R3, which put together a consortia of financial institutions, and where I was head of research there, but I had a couple other different roles at the same time. And then I left that company about 18 months ago, set up my own tech advisory company, and most of my clients past 18 months have been primarily on what we call the enterprise side of the ecosystem. I don't like that term, but that's kind of what people use in common day language. And we can talk about what that actually means or what it doesn't mean. And so today I do actual work for actual companies, but then I also occasionally chime in on social media, and I have my own private newsletter that I also have some good old fact checking that I do in there.
Yeah, I was going to say, and about your newsletter, it gets passed around quite a bit, and that's how I first came upon you. A lot of the guys that I run with are, hey, check this out, read this, and so on. So, that's really cool. Another way that I found you was, I guess it might not have been a galley copy, but an earlier iteration of The Truth Machine by Vina and Casey. And they tried to kind of be all things to all people. I think the book was kind of rushed, kind of pushed in favor of the crypto boom of late 2017. And as you corrected me when we started here, it was actually released early, almost a year to the day, in February of 2018. But that book by Wall Street Journal, connected and working for journalists, became a real standard, and I believe it's going to go, if it hasn't already, into paperback. To people in the space, let me get back to that word, to people who read it, who are savvy and kind of been in as long as you have, the book leaves a lot to be desired. And you actually, another way that I came upon you was through your blog, and you actually take that thing apart, the Truth Machine, almost page by page, right?
Yeah, it was page by page. I was on an airplane. A friend had let me give me a copy of it, his copy, and as I'm reading it, and I'm sure you should have them on the show so they could defend themselves or something like that. But it was just like, if you read my notes in the margin, it was every page I had this. I want to say triggered, but it was just things that sounded either wrong or massively biased. I mean, we can, they actually paint me and another guy named Preston Byrne as demons, as these villains in this whole narrative of convincing banks not to use Bitcoin, which is just ridiculous. I mean, we could go into that if you want, but like,
I for sure do.
This book is just, it's riddled with what you said, errors. I think because they try to rush it out to get there at the top of the hype. Again, or top of the peak of the hype cycle. Again, I don't know their side of the argument for why they published it when they did, but it seemed, even ignoring my arguments about how I felt it was one-sided or biased, just factually, number of errors. I posted in a very long book review. It took me significant, I'm trying to think how many weeks, because I had to do my normal job, and then I had to go through and type up all these little notes I put together. So I did the same thing for a couple other books too. I'm not trying to just single their book out. No,
yeah, and it's invaluable reading, because I think we tend to kind of as readers kind of take the last word as gospel and kind of move on from there. And this book is worth considering, maybe if not directly for the content, then for the influence I mean, it's literally everywhere, especially when it comes to crypto topics. So to correct the record, or to get a chance to annotate it, or to push back is, I think, really important. And you're one of the few that I've seen that have actually taken the time to do that. So first off, why do you think it was, I mean, other than what we just discussed with regard to, trying to kind of capture, which is, I'm not blaming them, but, they have a lot to say about the subject, and they're writing about it all the time. And some of them are actually invested in critical aspects of the ecosystem. Why do you think they wrote it? Like what do you think? What was the point they were trying to get across? Do you think?
Well, I think at least my takeaway, and again, it'd be good that maybe have them on the show to find out what the reason were. But I felt that my takeaway was that they are fairly involved in many different aspects and conversations and dialogues with the various participants. I'm trying to not say the word space, but that's really
me too.
In their daily life. I think Michael Casey said he spends about 80% of his time doing MIT DCI stuff. So the other 20% he's doing, I guess, unrelated or something related to CoinDesk or other projects he may be on his plate. And Paul's still over at Wall Street Journal,
right?
Still writing about cryptocurrency related stuff. So I assume it's because that's what they're passionate about. That's what they're really interested in. That's what their daily lives are. And they tried to put together a narrative that went from discussing maybe some of the politics and the technological parts. But to me, my takeaway is it came across as overly political. That didn't need to be, and then the technical stuff they missed out on a number of pieces as well.
And kind of a critical aspect that I like that you did as a quasi journalist here on I'm calling myself that, is that you actually kind of reached out to people like Roger Ver of Bitcoin.com and the Bitmain crew, and you kind of asked, did these guys talk to you? Like, did they interview? Did they even bother to get kind of your side of things? And that's something no one has brought up. And can you go into that a little bit as to why you did that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the first part was the reason I did that is because I actually reached out to Preston Byrne because they paint him as a villain. I've known Preston for about 5 years or so. He actually helped edit that book I mentioned, Great Chain of Numbers, back in February, March 2014. And I was like, hey, look, have you seen how they describe and characterize you? And he's like, oh, this is frustrating. And so he actually wrote, this long response back. I was like, you mind if I post this? So once I did that, I was like, well, maybe I should do the same thing for these other folks that didn't seem like they were, I don't remember the actual words in the book, but it was describing the block size debate, block size war, whatever you want to call it. And how they're like, oh, it's unclear why this Chinese company Bitmain was doing this. And I was like, why didn't you just email them? I mean, that's not that hard. I've met all these different people that message them. So I actually emailed Roger. I was like, hey, did they reach out to you? He's like, no, they did not. And then I contacted Bitmain, and one of their advisors said no, that they had not been contacted. So I was like, how hard could that be? I mean, they're the Wall Street Journal folks and MIT backgrounds. Surely that they could have one of their assistants do that. So again, I don't know what their excuse is, but they did that to a number of other people, and so that's why I felt that this was rushed. Like if they just spent like another couple of days or another couple of weeks just kind of ironing out some of that, they could have actually removed some sections, I think, from the book because of the way they I think unfairly painted and characterized folks like myself or Preston or the BCH crew, as it were.
And for you in particular, I remember an essay that you wrote, or no, you actually did write. It was on permission blockchains, right? And all that they involved rather. And I think also Casey and Vina in Truth Machine. When I was kind of prepping for our interview, I kind of read the sections on you and Preston, and I was looking at them, and I really couldn't tell what the import should be or what their main beef was with you, because I think at the point that you were kind of suggesting about 51% attacks and reorgs and stuff like that they were, again, this is their characterization, so I'm trying to kind of ferret out what exactly the issue was. And problems perhaps with proof of work and this is kind of uncontroversial. I mean, as far as I'm able to ascertain. And then I think, a few months later we had Ethereum Classic and some others actually get 51% attacked. And so, I mean, if anything, you've been, I guess, validated. So can you kind of go into maybe what their problem, do you understand what they were even criticizing you about? You mentioned the banks, but with regard to permission blockchains and so on?
Yeah, so those are some good questions there. Thanks for bringing that up. So I think that the characterization in the book actually stems from some offline conversations I've had with both of them over the years, including an interview with Michael back in 2015 after I wrote that paper. It was on permission blockchains. That was the first paper that anyone had written about it. By the way, I did not coin that term. That term actually comes from a guy named Robert Sams, who runs a company called Clearmatics, who's I'm advising. But that's a whole another conversation. But my point is from that initial phone call I had with him, I believe he said, Tim, but how this doesn't sync with the utopia of the Bitcoin world, and that's right. Again, that wasn't the purpose of these things. The Bitcoin world could live separate, and it will live separately from all these other endeavors. I don't see them as one has to dominate the other. Although I guess if you're a maximalist, that's kind of your mindset that only one chain or one ledger or whatever can rule the world. I don't agree with that particular view. But anyways. The excerpts, I'd actually received a pre-release of those as well, because somebody was saying, Tim, they make you out to be these villains, which basically it was the point you just made, that, hey, if you're a regulated financial institution and you had these instruments, these financial instruments with long life cycles, why would you put them on a chain that has the potential to be reorged and have no legal recourse about it? Now, the way I described it in other venues or the other writings in 2015, maybe they're still holding on to that. That's fine, but they didn't really cite exactly what their frustration was. I didn't see anything in the footnotes. So my assumption is that they were just kind of bringing in the context from the old, these other previous conversations into it. And it doesn't make a whole lot of sense because, to your point, there's been multiple different chains, not just the Ethereum Classic, although that's probably
right. It's certainly the most prominent recently.
And this wasn't even my own argument. I was re-articulating what various other folks, like when I wrote that permissioned, blockchain paper, as it were. I spoke to all these different vendors, and almost all those vendors had developers on those teams that were like, "Oh yeah, it's not uncommon to already go after these little altcoins." I think Coilcoin is something that was attacked like 6 years ago. I think Luke Dash Jr. was involved in that or something like that. But my point is these arguments that I had put forth were not necessarily mine, but not only that, but they had shown to be historically true, and they've only continued to take place throughout, since the publication of their book. So, I guess it'd be good to find out exactly what the beef is, as it were. And then if you want, I could kind of dive into what this enterprise world is, since we're kind of on that topic.
Yeah, and for sure, and just to kind of buttress your point, which so far the interview is just me serving you softballs, but I swear that this is really how I feel about it. I can be aggressive or not, but this really is how I feel about it. I believe there's always going to be a tension between, as we're just about to get into, the enterprise folks, or the because this is maybe unfair, but the more institutional folks who are looking at the financial side, and people who come at it from a tinkerer's point of view, from a developer's point of view, from a like you said, hobbyist, or people who got into it out of kind of an enthusiasm, because the cypherpunk ethos is, there are no sacred cows. Let's just take it apart and see what this thing is and see what it can do. So when you're talking to engineers and developers and so on, they want to know all the possible ways in which this is vulnerable. I mean, for God's sake, there's a whole industry dedicated to bug bounties, and and they challenge people to come in and try to break this thing that they've built. So if anything, even if you didn't intend to, you'd kind of fallen into our camp, where you were like, hey, this could happen. And in our space, we're very, very fond of saying, if it can happen, it's gonna happen. So I thought from what I took from it, I was like, even though they were trying to paint you as a villain, I was like, he's a good guy. Like, he's actually trying to, if, again, they might have gotten it all wrong and stumbled onto a point they weren't trying to make. But if anything, you were prescient. But yeah, on to the enterprise, there's some news, right? So I guess right now, dealing with security and surveillance and that tension between how far do crypto enthusiasts want to go into the mainstream world and back and forth. We've got some issues with Coinbase and Neutrino, and I think as we talked about it before, you have some thoughts on it, right? Oh, yeah.
So, yeah, you mentioned a number of things there that you brought up that I think we could touch on. Real fast. When I try to use the term enterprise, again, I don't like that term. It's just that's kind of how these companies describe themselves. It's roughly a dozen or so companies that are trying to build infrastructure for regulated financial institutions. I would use them, and I would separate them from these quote unquote institutional investments
that's a good
related to cryptocurrencies. Even though some of them are being underwritten by the same types of financial institutions, these large banks and asset managers, the functions are very, very different. So, and actually, on your point, again, I'm not trying to score points with any particular crowd at this stage, but I don't see why cryptocurrency, if you're truly trying to live this quote unquote cypherpunk ethos or whatever, however defined, why you would want to have regulated financial institutions to use your proof of work networks, because all they're going to do in the long run is, if these networks are, quote unquote supporting trillions of dollars of value, is want to have legal recourse. They want to have reduced risk and hold folks accountable. So if there's ever like a reorg, or if there's a fee that was fat fingered or something like that, they're going to want to have a way of having restitution to that. And as a result, they'll end up potentially lobbying for laws or pushing for specific entities in that disintermediation process to be re-intermediated. So I think it's actually self-defeating. But again, I'm apparently one of the few people who is actually saying, no, don't bring that in. But again, I can't stop institutions from playing around with trading desks. That's not.
But it really is. I think that's where we are right now, because we've got a bunch of people on, and I'm speaking from the sort of the crankier side of things. The more radical side of things, and I'm not saying that as a good or bad. It's kind of the pool that I represent. The tension is we have a bunch of people waiting for ETFs. They're waiting for this backed, sort of ice infused Starbucks coffee. I mean, there's all these moon dreams that we've had that the space has had for years, but there really is that tension that you're talking about. So be careful, because when you invite them in, you want that speculative price to jump, but it comes with a huge bargain.
Yeah, kind of a devil's bargain, right?
Really,
you want to? Can you hear me?
Yeah, no, I'm totally agreeing with you. So anyway, so the tension between enterprise then and crypto is very, very real, and Coinbase, just to kind of redirect us back there, is emblematic of that, right? Of that tension.
Yeah, so I think that what you're referring to with Coinbase specifically this time around is their acquisition of a company that provides, at least they market themselves as an analytics provider for compliance reasons, particularly for AML, anti-money laundering laws. And it turns out that the management team, or at least 2 or 3 people on the executive team, previously worked for a spyware entity called Hacking Team, which provided basically the dictators of the world and authoritarian governments of the world with tools to spy on not only the residents, but whistleblowers or human rights activists and so forth. And there's been a supposed backlash. It's this hashtag delete Coinbase has been going on. I think it's kind of, again, this is just my own view. I think that most people that are really complaining probably weren't even Coinbase customers in the first place. not that justifies, not that gets rid of their argument, but if you look at these people who push initially, these are the guys who been saying get your coins off of intermediaries for years, never use Coinbase types of things. So putting that aside for the moment, the analytics providers out there, there's a handful of them. In full disclosure, I'm an advisor to one called Blockseer. There's others like Chainalysis, Elliptic out there, ScoreChain. They all kind of do the same thing in the sense that they all work with exchanges to help provide AML analytics. And most of this stuff, or actually almost all of it, is public information, like the fact that you're sending a transaction on Bitcoin blockchain or the Ethereum blockchain, you're leaving a footprint, as it were. And if you connect those footprints to legal identities, you can potentially build a case against participants. So there was the most recent one, and this is why I think Coinbase may have felt the need to acquire someone. Is there was a news story about a month or so ago, maybe 5-6 weeks, by an Israeli newspaper that connected some transactions with Hamas. The fundraising, I think, was like $2,500.
Right.
and it was through a Coinbase account. And this is right around the same time that the head data scientist at Coinbase was leaving. So there's a lot of, again, I'm not saying that they aren't all just coincidences, but the timing of it was such that if your head of data science is leaving and you're getting some bad press because of this incident with Hamas, maybe you go out of your way to just acquire a team that's on the market, so that way you could assuage regulators and get that competency brought on board. I don't have evidence of that, but several I don't want to say insiders, but some folks familiar with the situation have speculated the same thing. Either way, it's backfired on the organization in the sense that
to put it mildly,
and that's if people think that other exchanges aren't going to be doing the same thing in the sense the analytics isn't going to take place, it's going to take place. It's just who's actually running the show. I mean. Again, I'm not saying everyone else on these other teams is from the hacking team, but there's only a small group of people who are probably really familiar with it right now. Perhaps that will change in the future. Again, I'm not trying to justify the purchase. I'm not trying to dismiss the concerns. I obviously have my own strong views about not enabling authoritarians. I previously worked out in China for a number of years, and I can tell you my disdain for things like the Great Firewall, but it's a whole other conversation beyond the scope of this podcast.
Yeah, and so you having that kind of intimate knowledge, I think, is super important to have you on right now because of the conversation that Coinbase and Neutrino bring us into. And I think you framed it very well. You kind of set it up nicely. So to kind of take us back to your initial premise, which was when you invite these guys in and when you have the Coinbases of the world out there, and I mean, on the positive side, to kind of steel man Coinbase, and I'm a fan from afar. I've never used the product, again, because I've got the cranky ideological stuff behind me. But to steel man them a bit, I mean, they have onboarded, millions of people into crypto who may otherwise, didn't want to download, a wallet, have to deal with keys, and, Lord knows what else you might have to deal with on local Bitcoins. They just found the whole process icky. Coinbase kind of smoothed that out, had a nice UX, get in there, get out, link into your bank account, bada boom, bada bing. And they have taken that business model that I've completely flattened here, but they've taken the business model and moved it out to get the BIT license. They're moving into custodial services, professional stuff. So they're trying to kind of be both the kind of have a foot in that crazy crypto world and also in the mainstream. And then you get the Neutrino, which I had not heard your insight there. So what you're saying is that they'd had some issues going forward with tracking where money was coming and going, and so maybe there's maybe a thought that they were trying to address that subject by bringing in pros, and in doing so, they kind of just doubled down on what might be an incredibly bad idea in terms of public relations.
Yeah, I don't think. Okay, if you looked at all the companies that they could have acquired, let's assume everyone was on the market that provides analytics.
I think Jesse of Kraken actually put something up like this. But
yeah, he tweeted something yesterday. Like 5 different companies. Elliptic was one of them. Chainalysis and a couple others, including this highly flammable company. The point being, though, is if they acquired any of them, it wouldn't have made anyone happy. It's just this is more egregious because of the hacking team background.
Right.
Again, people have been complaining at Chainalysis or these other companies for the same, hey, how dare you spy on us? Well, like, look, this information is public. You can't tell me I can't look at it. Like, it's supposed to be permissionless access to data, right? To use that term that they prefer. So yeah, we could we could talk for a while on the analytics part, but if you wanted just to take a step back on this quote unquote institutionalization of funding, I think that the area, again, I'm not trying to bring in a common group of family or build bridges per se, but the intermediation or the re-intermediation of this the cryptocurrency world, it to me seems like a complete contradiction. Like my reading from the original Satoshi paper and documents from thereafter was the purpose of that was to remove intermediaries. Again, I don't know. I'm not ideological. If anything, I'm like the anti-maximalist, as it were. But if that was the goal, if the goal was to create a payment system in which unknown participants could send, without being gated, e-cash to someone else without an intermediary processing that, or at least doing KYC, as it were, it seems like that trend is completely reversed. We have enormous amount of intermediaries, including Coinbase, that are effectively systemically important to that ecosystem. But we could talk about that forever. But that's why I feel that if I do talk too much, or if I do end up tweeting, it's because I see a lot of irony in how this ecosystem's evolved in the last 10 years. See, I didn't use the word space. I used the euphemism that time. If you want, we could really quickly dive into what I call the actual enterprise DLT world.
Yeah, and that was where I was going to head to right now. So how does what's the connection then to enterprise if it's not institutional and you're not dyeing your hair blue and you don't have an anarchy tattoo, so you're not Brian Armstrong and you're not Tim May. Are you sort of the happy medium there, or?
No, I think the two worlds. So again, not to defend the cypherpunks, but if the original ethos was to create an alternative ecosystem for which they can conduct commerce, I can't do anything to prevent that at this stage. And not would I want to spend any effort to do that? It seems like futile for me to trying to stop it. But I think you could take some of the lessons of how you can disintermediate stuff and reapply those in a world of highly regulated financial institutions. And I learned that process through advising or being an advisor to these different companies and having all these different conversations with financial institutions that are highly competitive with one another. And yet they still have to rely on, and they have to legally rely on using certain intermediaries to settle transactions. So there's this world of financial market infrastructures. That's what the term is, FMI. That are things like CSDs, these central securities depositories, central banks. You have CCPs, central counterparties, like clearinghouses such as CME, that provide these very useful societal, socially useful functions in the sense that they provide settlement and certainty around that. Although on the flip side, because they're so heavily concentrated post 2008, because of all the different mergers and acquisitions, you have highly concentrated systemic risk. So if these institutions blow up, then you don't even have to check your balances at different accounts because it just won't exist. Like if one of these large, ignoring even a CSD or CCP going under, even a large custody bank going under would wreak havoc across an entire country, if not countries. Again, I'm not trying to scare people into. I'm just saying that you have some serious issues. And I'm not the person who was saw this. This is something that regulators have been trying to grapple for decades. That's why there's actually sets of guidelines that have been built by different financial or nonprofit organizations and international bodies like IOSCO and the Bank of International Settlements. I know that the cryptocurrency people don't necessarily like them. That's fine. They're not trying to they're not trying to wave the anarchy flag. But there are some I think good reflective points to potentially reuse from the cryptocurrency world tried to illustrate. Whether they went through that vision, that's a whole other conversation. But with the world, for example, with Clearmatics, they're my primary client at this stage, and I've been an advisor for them for a number of years. They put together a consortia around creating a central bank digital currency. I know that sounds ironic. Hey, Tim, how can you rely on central banks to issue currency? How does that at all disintermediation? Well, you can actually disintermediate participants in the post-trade process. What post-trade is you and I as retail users of a broker, we may ask the broker to send a trade in where the exchange actually executes that, and then that process after the execution becomes this post-trade process, and everyone may think that it's super smooth and clean, but you have breakages, you have errors. And in the settlement process, the actual clearing and settlement of that trade not only takes several days, but could end up in a situation in which you don't necessarily know who actually owns it. That's not a risk that people necessarily want to have. They want to have riskless or risk-free or less risky trades, especially the larger they are. So there's an entire apparatus, this multi-billion-dollar apparatus of this thing called post-trade settlement world, and part of that involves how cash is actually sent to settle this. There's these acronyms: DVP, PVP, it's delivery versus payment, payment versus payment. One's involving securities, one's involving foreign exchange. But the bottom line, if you're a listener and you're trying to understand it, there's an entire world of acronyms that are actually very useful for us for society to function. You may not like it as an anarchist and you want to get rid of it. That's fine. I'm not saying that it has to exist in the way it does. In fact, the point of me working with several of these organizations is to try and change how risk has been concentrated with technology. And so I'm not going to sit here and shill a particular solution, but other than I've written on this topic, as have some of my friends like Sarah Feenan, on this topic of DFMI, decentralized financial market infrastructure. How can you take existing financial market infrastructure that provides a socially useful function, settlement, the optics, transparency, and oversight, and then how can you remove the intermediaries that no longer need to provide that function because technology can replace those particular functions? I know there's a long-winded explanation of what.
No, it's really good, and I'm learning a ton here. So to put it into my ease for listeners here, it's that we have, let's say in the United States, we have good money, which I know is heretical to say, but relatively speaking, we can, I give them my little plastic card, or I fling my numbers onto Amazon, and I get my goodies. I get my plastic crap from China, whatever I get, and everything settles. At least as I know, on my end, a certain number of units were moved out of my account, and wherever they go, but they're no longer mine, and I have the shiny new thing. What you're saying is that there is an entire infrastructure, a scaffolding underneath all that allows for what to the sort of surface-dwelling consumer seems to be frictionless ease, wonderful, fast payments is actually a whole, for lack of a better phrase, trust mechanisms that all kind of operate with each other. And then I think what you're suggesting, and it's something that we've talked about before, is that there are innovations through cryptocurrency and through the enterprise side and sort of institutional finance, which I know you've separated for us, but the combination of all of these three things that can make something that's actually more efficient, that's a little bit more honest, that kind of combines the best of all worlds. And the analogy that I think of whenever we talk about this stuff is something like NASCAR. So you see these guys, driving 500 miles on a left turn, and you think, well, this is a ridiculous waste of everybody's time. Like, I don't get it, I don't understand it. But as someone explained, during sort of the pit stops and kind of the background, is that the innovations out of this seemingly nonsensical, waste of everybody's time, actually eventually make it to your car. So your Hyundai or your Acura or whatever comes with better tires as a result, or better tread, or what I can continue with the analogy ad infinitum. But did I explain that well, or where did I trip up?
Yeah, no, I don't think that's a bad analogy. The two worlds, if we're going to separate the anarchic world of cryptocurrencies to the archic world, the law and order world of regulated financial institutions, if it's open source tech, or even if it's not open source, you're probably something's gonna leak and you're gonna find out some information about the tech. I don't see why they couldn't coexist. In fact, I think I've been fairly consistent with saying, hey, there's nothing you can do about it. These two worlds are going to coexist. If you don't like it, that's fine. I am of the view that the regulated financial institutions are going to probably be faster at providing real adoption. And it's not going to be, to your point, like, it's the stuff in the background. You and I, fortunately, do not have to think about how ACH works or how the wiring system works, how SWIFT works. We don't have to do that. And I think it's it's a problem of expectation management for the cryptocurrency world. Is everyone's trying to get people excited, retail users excited about what's fundamentally financial market infrastructure that is supposed to be in the background, and yet everyone has to become an expert in how to be your own bank or be your own financial market infrastructure, which is a pain in the butt. Everyone's always losing keys. Everyone's exchanges, all these exchanges are getting hacked. And again, I'm not saying it can't improve or won't get better. I'm sure that there's plenty of good arguments for the opposite. But fundamentally, a cryptocurrency network is some type of financial market payment system. I know there's a whole group of, I guess you call lobbyists that don't want to use that term because there's a regulatory connotation around, say, for example, FinCEN explicitly exempts miners from having to get money transmitter license. Because it's quote unquote decentralized. I would argue it's decentralization theater. There's actually all the miners already know each other. They talk to each other on WeChat. They go to the same events. So that's beside the point. Your analogy about things behind the scenes and about the NASCARs of the world that go through and put things through their paces first before they quote unquote trickle down to other areas. Maybe that's true. I would say that. At least the part in the background, I hope stays that way. I don't want to have to become an expert on Swift GPI, even though I know what it does at this stage because of all the different events that I've been to discussing that. Any more than I want to know how to fly, how to actually fly the plane I'm getting into. I mean, it may be nice to know how to fly the Boeing or the Airbus, but the cool thing about regular passengers is we don't have to become experts in every single thing we do. We don't have to become our own doctors. We don't have to become our own silversmiths, or we don't have to become our own mechanics. If we had to become self-sufficient in everything, we could never get anything done because we don't have to be experts in everything. So I know it's a long-winded explanation for saying I agree with your analogy. But yeah, I think there's some expectation management that can be done on both sides. I think the quote-unquote enterprise vendors, if you want to call them, did a horrible job of managing everyone's expectations around financial market infrastructure, how long it would take for post-trade systems to be changed. And the answer to that is, as of March 2019, none of these systems have been replaced. In fact, if anything, these companies, you've seen this huge churn of executives, most recently, digital assets out in New York. They've lost their CEO. They've had 2 CTOs in 16 months. So again, I'm not trying to single them out. I'm just saying it's really difficult. And if you don't manage your investor expectations or user expectations, then you could have complete burnout and fatigue. And I think we've seen that. There's been no new quote unquote enterprise vendors aside from these dozen that have been around for a couple of years. I think of one actually, but I won't name them because I don't want to make them look good or bad. On the other side of the cryptocurrency world, it's nonstop. It's drama per second, I think is what Eamon Goodsire calls it. So it's good fun to watch. I think that there are some good lessons to be learned from both sides. Although I'm probably not going to win any hugs from the Maximalist crowd for saying that on
for sure not. But and it's not just a U.S. problem, right? Because have you been watching what's going on with Revolut at all? And their
they apparently their compliance team in January it was discovered. Revolut, for those listeners, is a fintech company in the UK that's been trying to provide retail banking services without actually having like retail offices. It's basically like an app. Anyways,
they were a golden child, right? I mean, they couldn't do that wrong for a while.
Absolutely, yeah, and apparently, and I think they actually supported cryptocurrencies at one point. Like they allowed you to track your Bitcoin wallet, something related. If you just Google Revolut,
they still dabble, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so anyways, yeah, they some news the last week or so is that the compliance team, someone turned off some AML process that tracked where funds were coming from. And I think the reaction now has been so bad that I think the CFO may have just resigned. I'd have to double check that. I may be jumping the gun on that. But yeah, basically, I'm not here to pick on just cryptocurrency companies going bust or being busted. But we see this with fintechs. We see this with regulated financial institutions like Wells Fargo. Was hit with not just fines from the federal government, from states. I think it was $500 million because of this program they put in place a couple of years ago that was very aggressive marketing towards existing customers to open up new accounts. So it was account inflation. And the whistleblowers who had pointed this out actually got their records were were had a black mark on it, so they couldn't get hired from other banks. So
Right.
it was a very perverse system in which the retail users themselves got hosed, the whistleblowers and the people who said this is not right got hosed. And then again, I'm not saying what the punishment should be, but the punishment so far is Wells Fargo has not been allowed to expand in the U.S. They had to cap certain things regionally. But it continues to happen even if it's regulated. That's not to say that regulations should be thrown away. I know the anarchists out there say, oh, this is why we don't need a regulation. We've had cryptocurrency exchanges not have any kind of oversight, and they just go completely up, and then there's no recourse. A whole nother conversation for another podcast. But yeah, unfortunately, scams and fraud take place in both of those ecosystems.
Yeah, and just to put a bow on Revolut, there you're right. Their CFO did resign, and the company actually put out a statement thanking him and so on, and described him as a friend, and just kind of a weird coincidence they said with regard to some of the things that were happening with their compliance issues. And it's, again, if we get into the weeds, that's the problem. It's more looking at the ecosystem, and again, that tension that exists between trying to, on the one hand, be the hotshot cryptocurrency that makes promises about decentralization, permissionlessness, peer-to-peer, this and that, and then trying to market that to mom and dad, trying to make it retail and do that in a regulated environment. There's just a lot of tension and some really interesting issues that arise as we're seeing in real time. So you're the perfect person to have on to talk about this. So before I let you go, and I told you half an hour, and I done nothing but lie to you. I kept you on for even longer. Let's where do you see crypto? For my audience, if you had a crystal ball, you're an OG. I mean, you've been in the space. There's that word again for a long time, and you've seen all the iterations. You're just as familiar as most others, and you're obviously on the enterprise side of things. What's your kind of crystal ball prediction, say for let's limit it to 2019, or if you want to go beyond that, that's fine. But what's your general take on the future of crypto?
Yeah, for what it's worth, I don't think most OGs would call me OG because they're very elitist like that. But anyways, I'm not trying to market myself as some old school Satoshi guy. So I guess the prediction I have is without more real credible oversight, you're going to continue to see the same types of shenanigans we continue to see with exchanges, with types of coins being issued without BitConnect. You can clearly see the warning flags 2 years ago, and these exchanges that listed it, they're not giving back any of the money that they got from trading fees yet. They're all like, oh yeah, shame, BitConnect's totally, we're going to completely deslist it. What are you going to do with those funds that you accumulated from these retail investors? So again, I don't want to single out the worst of the worst, but those continue to persist despite the fact everyone says, oh no, it's getting better, we're self-regulating, and I just don't see much evidence of that. So I assume that the trend that we've seen in the last couple of years in terms of the illicit activity will continue. I think Japan just announced that they've seen a 10x rise in money laundering take place. So again, I could talk about the horrible things, and then you could hire someone else on who could be very bullish. I think that you will have a lot of unfortunate energy towards these kind of gimmicky, I hate calling Lightning Network complete gimmicky, but it really seems, and that's, we have a whole nother episode on the mismanaged expectations. Every 6 weeks, every 6 months, it's supposed to come out and be out there. And
18 months. We're 18 months away.
So again, it'd be good to have someone who's like hardcore, go Lightning, I guess, on the show too, just to balance that out. But I think that without managing expectations, you're going to have fatigue. You're going to have retail users who are like, screw this, I'm going to go do something else. Unless you have another exuberant, period of mania like you did at the end of 2017. Again, I don't think that's healthy, by the way, because it really brings in the worst scammers in the world who just want to get rich quick. If anything, you should want to have a purging, and if that comes through, purging of prices. Again, I'm not here to predict price action or whatever, but you can wash those folks out. Only the only folks who will stay will be those who actually truly want to build. But again, that's kind of my view for every year, not just 2019.
Very, very cool. Well, again, I've taken way too much of your time, and what an education, man. You kind of put on a clinic here. I really do appreciate it. I appreciate the time. Congratulations to you and the wife on the baby. And where can people find you? Where can they find your work if they want to follow you?
Sure, yeah. I'm on Twitter. My handle is @ofnumbers, and my website is ofnumbers.com. Pretty easy.
Wonderful. Well, again, my guest has been Tim Swanson. We'll have links to pretty much everything he cited in the show notes. Again, a super pleasure. It's been a long time coming, so I really appreciate you coming on, Tim. Thank you.
Thank you, Edward. Take care.